My name is Eric Walters, and I serve as the Director of STEM Education at Marymount School of New York, where I teach physics, atmospheric science, and various technology electives. I'm excited to share the results of my action research project, Who Controls the Learning? Examining the impact of an autodidactic framework in a grade 12 girls' atmospheric science class. Marymount School of New York is an independent, all-girls N through 12 school in New York City. We are a member of the RSHM network of schools, which has 21 schools in 9 countries, operating under the same goals and criteria and the overarching principle that all may have life. Our school's mission, students who challenge, shape, and change the world, drives our curriculum in directions that focus on creativity, curiosity, innovation, independent learning, and the social good. Our cohort's research focused on the global reset in education as a result of the pandemic. The pandemic changed how we teach and how we value, evaluate, and assess understanding. The pandemic also changed how students learn. Phrases like asynchronous learning and hybrid learning entered our vocabulary. As teachers, we assumed that students knew how to manage their learning during asynchronous classes. We assumed that they would sit down at home when class started, work independently on an assignment, and complete that assignment in an hour. But that's not how students work. That's not even how adults work. My students admitted that they were more successful when they planned their own learning during the day. After all, class schedule aside, that's how they completed their work pre-pandemic, in a schedule that made sense to them. So if students could set up a learning schedule that made sense to them at home, could they also set up a learning schedule that made sense to them in school? This led to my research question: how does a self-directed learning framework strengthen a grade 12 girl's autonomy and independence in the atmospheric science classroom? My senior elective, Atmospheric Science, is an activity-based and project-based class in which students explore the physical and dynamic processes behind weather and climate. In the first unit, students explore the skills necessary to access, collect, and analyze real-time weather data so that they may research, write, and produce a weather forecast for a selected city. I chose this unit for my research project since, in previous iterations, students worked collaboratively to build these skills and then individually to apply these same skills. Transforming this unit into a self-directed learning framework would make for an appropriate model for my research project. I also designed opportunities for my students to reflect on their learning, including written and video reflections, along with task assessment and learning profile surveys. Data was collected regularly throughout the research period. Students used a self-directed learning framework as a guide throughout the unit. Quantitative data collected included a pre- and post-project self-directed learning survey, along with a metacognitive awareness inventory. Qualitative data included pre- and post-project interviews and reflections, along with a weekly learning plan. The goal was for students to create for themselves and for me a portrait of themselves as a learner. To begin the conversation, I selected several students to be part of a focus group. I wanted to explore several ideas with them. What motivates them to learn, and what do they enjoy about learning? How do they describe themselves as a learner, and how do they approach project work? It was evident from the student responses that they already understood their strengths and weaknesses as learners. As one student noted, self-expression is an important factor in staying motivated. Another student stated, when presented with a project, I prioritize my time and split my work into smaller chunks. A third student added, I enjoy learning in physical classrooms when the teacher is engaging and materials are interactive and visual. I also like having the structure of knowing what's expected ahead of time. Each student noted they appreciated teachers that take the time to get to know them as learners. Before the project began, I thought it was important for my students to analyze their habits of mind with regard to self directed learning. I implemented the self directed learning survey based on a rubric developed by Best Futures in New Hampshire, which gave me insights on their learning on topics such as initiative, ownership, monitoring, and adapting. Part one of the student learning profile was complete. Students also need to, quote, think about how they think. The metacognitive awareness inventory helped my students answer questions such as, how am I thinking? Where am I in the learning process? Am I developing my conceptual knowledge? What strategies am I implementing or developing to learn more effectively? The results gave me insights about how my students think about their learning. I opted not to share the results of these surveys with my students as I did not want to bias their responses at the end of the research process. Only now do I realize that might have been the wrong choice. My students needed to know their learning profile, not just me. The learning pathway provided students with a roadmap to guide their learning during the research project. Consider their study of numerical weather prediction, for example. They reviewed what they needed to master, as outlined by the essential questions, and developed their understanding of forecasting models by using multimodal content found on Wakelet. They then applied what they had hopefully learned by analyzing real-time numerical weather prediction data. They then took a formative assessment to demonstrate mastery. If a student was not successful in that regard, they would go back, review the material, and complete the activity again using new data. At the end of the activity, students will review their learning and understanding with me. The unit included 9 individual activities as outlined on the Learning Activities chart. In a final project, activity number 9, students researched, wrote, and produced a 2-day video weather forecast for an assigned city. Students were evaluated on how close their forecasts were to the actual high and low temperatures for their city. In general, their scores were no different than student forecasting scores in previous years. The framework also required students to plan their learning for the week. What did they hope to accomplish during the week? What work would they do in class and out of class? And what indicators would they use to measure success? I reviewed these learning plans with my students on a regular basis. At the end of each learning cycle, usually 1 week, students reflected on their learning plan. Did they accomplish what they set out to do? If not, why not? How would they then approach their work differently going forward? I also reviewed these reflections with my students on a regular basis. As the project progressed, it became clear to me that some students struggled mightily with self-directed learning. Several refused to complete the learning plan or reflection. I was tempted to intervene, but I wanted to let the learning process play out. But I did want to see if I could find a reason for this animosity towards self-directed learning. After the research period was completed, I administered the Dweck Mindset Instrument. Here is where the answer lied. Every successful self-directed learner identified as having a growth mindset. By the end of the research period, I had a wealth of data to analyze. Was the self-directed learning framework I had developed an effective learning guide for my students? Qualitative data included individual student interviews and post-project video reflections. I used Sonics.ai to transcribe these videos, and then combining these transcripts with weekly reflections, used an AI tool to reduce the volume of data and to organize that data around major themes. Quantitative data included the results of the self-directed learning surveys and the metacognitive awareness inventories. I also evaluated the student responses to the Dweck Mindset Instrument. One thing about my students, they are honest. I think this comes from creating a space in my classroom where regular feedback in the course is valued and addressed. Students appreciate that I have a finger on the pulse of their learning every day, and I'm willing to reorient the learning to meet their needs as learners. I try to focus on the user experience. The learning has to work for the learner, not just the teacher. The end of project reflections provided additional evidence that my students know who they are as learners. Students appreciated the learning framework provided and that there were multiple avenues of support for them. They also wanted more opportunities to discuss challenging concepts as a class as opposed to working through these individually. That's the student's need for social-based learning. And as one student stated directly, self-directed learning just reinforced my bad study skills. The statistical data highlighted several areas of improvement and non-improvement. Most significantly, students improved in their ability to cite examples from their work to evaluate how they might expand their strengths by setting learning goals. They also improved in their ability to adopt new strategies in their approach to their learning. However, some students did not improve in their ability to adapt or expand their strengths and interests to successfully complete new tasks. There was also a significant drop in students' confidence in seeking help and analyzing learning tasks that might reshape, extend, or enhance their learning. This may be because some students believed they had to work independently and could not seek help from me. In general, students could set learning goals, but they struggled to realign those goals as the learning progressed. As a teacher, I cannot assume that my students know how to navigate asynchronous learning, but I can give them the freedom and flexibility to direct their learning in ways that work best for them. My students may know who they are as learners, but they also want to work collaboratively solving real-world problems that are meaningful to them. The most significant finding? Teachers and students need to converse about how a student learns best. One thing was clear. The growth mindset students know they have a growth mindset and they believe they possess the necessary skills and attributes to direct their own learning. These students were able to easily adapt to the learning framework. On the other hand, the fixed mindset students know they have a fixed mindset. These students needed additional support to be successful. However, they often did not seek assistance with the framework. For the most part, these students expressed disdain for self-directed learning, so much so that even mentioning the term made them cringe. Based on student feedback, the framework was too limiting for all students. There needed to be opportunities for social-based learning, contextualized learning, and untethered learning as well. My students needed more variety, more differentiation, and more opportunities to dissect challenging topics as a group, and should have had more input in how the learning framework played out. I learned a lot from this experience. My research had more twists and turns than Topanga Canyon Boulevard that connects the San Fernando Valley with the Pacific Coast Highway in Southern California. I assumed that everything would go perfectly and that all of my students would enjoy being on the pathway to mastery. Because the learning was not contextualized for my students in a meaningful way, some students disengaged completely from the learning process. This disengagement impacted their attitude toward the course for the entire year. The learning experience should have been designed with the user experience in mind. To be effective learners, my students needed to know the time requirements for each activity, as well as how each activity connected to the broader topic of weather forecasting. For some students, once they decided that their preferred learning style did not align with self-directed learning, there was nothing I could do to make that alignment happen. Finally, the lack of collaborative learning experiences and the lack of diverse learning experiences impacted the students' learning journey as well. I'd hoped for a class with active learners. Instead, My class was filled with students quietly completing their work. They saw this project as a means to an end for me as their teacher, but not a project that validated their own learning. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or comments about my research, please reach out to me using the contact information provided. Thank you.